Ladies and gentlemen, what a great pleasure it is to be here with you this morning. And I have to say that I did glance at that video when it was sent to me by the good folks at ICES, not least the wonderful Carrie Arn. And I was struck by many things. First, those 1970s production values. But also by the fact that Bill Schrag, who featured right at the start of the video, I'm sorry to say, as many will know, is no longer with us. And a sad loss for the system. But also by the evergreen nature of our circumstances. You know, there we are talking about tough times, cost containment, doing at least as well, if not more, with less. Wow, here we are 20 years later back in the same pickle. It's back to the future in an awfully familiar surround, and it also speaks to the evergreen importance of ICES and the work that everyone in this room has done and continues to do. Obviously, that goes for those who have had the CEO seat, Jack Williams, Andreas Lapakis, David Henry, but it goes meaningfully for all those who are being on faculty and senior scientists, scientist and associate scientist roles, the fabulous research coordinators, the remarkable individuals working with the data as programmers and analysts, all the support staff in various roles, and not least, a remarkable succession of talented students and fellows who have proceeded through the Institute and who now are being educated and trained in a myriad of sites as the Institute has expanded. It is a long way from where we started. And indeed, in preparing this speech, I had some considerable difficulty because, of course, as I scribbled a few notes, which is what I generally do, unfortunately, not much more, I found all these wonderful memories kept flooding back. And it was very hard to stay on any kind of coherent intellectual theme. Instead, I was thinking, oh, yes, Patty Perfect, Patty Pinfold, or Pam Slaughter, and all those wonderful memories came flooding back of great people that I met and worked with. In that regard, I have to also confess that I would much rather not be giving any remarks. It would be so much more fun to be circulating and reminiscing and meeting the next generation of ICES leaders and workers in this remarkably productive enterprise. And I will try to keep these remarks a little shorter than planned. But of course, there is nothing more dangerous than a university president at a podium. I think here one of my predecessors who once said that a president should be a ball of fire by day and a bag of wind by night. In this case, you may have fire and wind, but we'll do our best. You know, in addition to a huge sense of gratitude and frankly a bit of surprise at how this institute has endured and its continuing value, I have above all a sense of huge good fortune. I have to tell you that, in perhaps the mythology, the blueprint for ICES somehow spraying from my word processor was probably a 64K K-Pro or something equally primitive back then. This is, I have to say, a little bit of mythology, and I do want to spend a bit of time highlighting happenstance, because the older you get and the more varied leadership roles you hold, the more clear it becomes that all these successes are not only about the team and the people who carry the real weight, but they're also hugely about happenstance and great good fortune. Now, let me just give you a few markers of happenstance. When I went off to Oxford in 1979, I had a thesis plan that bore no relationship to what I eventually ended up writing. And what I ended up writing was much more in the realm of social science and history, which frankly bored me a lot of the time. And so much of my excess energy was spent reading about healthcare. And it was pretty clear that there had been a succession of very important studies. For example, the health insurance plan of New York, running in the middle part of the last century, doing what we would now call health services research. As I trolled through a whole variety of old policy documents and briefs and advocacy submissions by physicians and hospital administrators, there was a pattern that emerged pretty clearly that the system, despite its ostensible reliance on evidence, actually had a remarkable degree of variability and had no consistent lens on what was being done. In essence, there was a science of epidemiology that related to population health. There was an emerging science of clinical epidemiology that purported to be a basic science for clinical research and clinical medicine. But there was still not what one might call an epidemiology of health care, of medical care, of health services, let alone anything linking those ideas to the population health realm. So this was not some startling or fresh insight. It was the product of boredom sitting in the wonderful libraries of Oxford and trolling through ancient medical journals in between coughing fits engendered by the dust as you opened them up, because it was a pre-digital era. Another point that I do want to highlight in the realm of happenstance is that an individual who I flagged a little bit in some of the question and answer that I believe appears in the magazine deserves a huge amount of credit for the political force that made this possible. Let's go back and recognize that the province of Ontario was then not the most visionary in terms of how it understood and saw the development of research relevant to healthcare. They had moved with some tentativeness into clinical and health services research, but the notion of actually creating an institute of this nature was not one that would have immediate traction or appeal. You can turn that down, it's echoing. Thank you. So, no. Can we get that volume down? It's really echoey. Thank you. That's better. When you have a voice like an overhead projector, audiovisual support struggles at times. I apologize for that. I'll try to speak more loudly and raise it to a tenor rather than a basso profundo. So when one looked at the ministry's vision for the system and its analytical capacity, it was not only vestigial, but their willingness to fund research was somewhat limited. What made the initial block grant possible, frankly, was a certain amount of medical politics. And in that respect, a leading figure was a fellow who will be known to very few in this room named Adam Linton, also, sadly, someone who passed away, indeed before ICES was off the ground. But Linton had been a clinical leader at the University of Western Ontario in what was then Victoria Hospital. I was a resident there. On returning from Oxford, we had endless discussions around the role of organized medicine and the profession in general in healthcare and health services, the obligation of quality and efficiency and accessibility. Adam was a terror on his fellow physicians when he was physician-in-chief if they were wasteful or inefficient at the bedside. His concern was not only that resources that were scarce were being misused, but that many of these interventions put patients at risk for no good reason. And so there was a meeting of minds. Linton stepped down as chief of medicine at Victoria Hospital, and his considerable energies had to be directed somewhere. We'd already done a two-hander for the New England Journal of Medicine on organized medicine and technology assessment a year or two earlier, and he found his way through the ranks of the Ontario Medical Association, where he exerted a considerable influence in the genesis of ICES in and around negotiations between the OMA and the government in the tough times of 1991. And on the other side of the table, then, I should add, was Michael Decter, who was the lead negotiator for the government, later Deputy Minister of Health. So this was a situation where, in many fundamental ways, stars aligned totally by happenstance. I would add that I was an advisor to the OMA in those negotiations. Jonathan Lomas, who was then director of the Centre for Health Economics and Policy Analysis at McMaster, advised the government. We got $20 million. McMaster got nothing. We know who won the negotiations. But never mind, just having some fun at Jonathan's expense. Let me, however, move away from the politics to a key issue of what I think has made ICES unique in terms of its positioning in the ecosystem of health research. And many in this room saw it and lived it. And this comes back to what one could see looking in the 1940s and 50s at all those wonderful studies out of integrated health plans in the US and indeed out of the National Health Service of the United Kingdom. And that is a focus on the epidemiology of medical care. When one looked down the road in that period, the wonderful flowering of clinical epidemiology at McMaster, led by Sackett and Haynes and Tugwell, later by Guyot, there was a focus very clearly on the clinical realm, on clinical research evidence. When one looked at the sister entity, that great university, the Center for Health Economics and Policy Analysis, the focus was macro, health economics and policy. There was in between this massive area, this huge gap, and it was that gap which was not being filled in Ontario and was being filled to some extent by the visionary work of the Rousses in Manitoba. But there was certainly a vacuum, and it was into that vacuum that many of us stepped through the clinical epidemiology unit that was founded at Sunnybrook in roughly the same period, and it was that vacuum that ICES filled and that it continues not only to fill, but in many ways through its work to redefine the data and information needs of the system. So what you have done remains essential. There is no one else doing it as well. There's no single resource that has trained as many individuals who've gone out and mirrored your work collectively as they have carried those ideas to other provinces and indeed to other nations. And in these difficult times fiscally, when the system needs ideas and evidence and information, when it needs to have a mirror held up to it, no one is doing more important work than you are doing through this organization. So it is a pleasure to acknowledge happenstance and the derivative nature of some of those ideas, even as one wishes you a happy birthday. I want to just move a little bit to the reminiscences of someone who is also keenly aware that these entities are so much about people, and give you some sense of, again, the happenstance involved in something like this coming together all those years ago. I went off to Toronto Western as an assistant professor and new faculty member, and who would turn up right there but Tony Bashinsky, physician, general practitioner, also a PhD statistician, who was one of the key players in getting the clinical epidemiology unit going, as well as in the early days of ICES. And of course, Vivek Goel, a legendary figure in health research, now leader of the Public Health Agency, and with whom I had the pleasure of working when he was provost of the University of Toronto, was someone who had been a graduate student in the group where I worked as a research fellow. Vivek, by a happy coincidence, returned from Harvard. He was temporarily out of work. We were able to snap him up. It was the best thing we ever did. Or again, wandering around A4. A few of you will remember those corridors that we worked in at Sunnybrook. And I wandered down the corridor, and there was Laurie Ferris, psychologist, health service researcher, and another recruit added to the team, all happenstance. The new Democratic government brought in a new deputy minister, and Marcia Cohen landed on our doorstep. And suddenly we had a window into the outstanding work done by the Rousses, and we had a clear capacity to start to develop the administrative data in which we were already interested. Don DeBoer arrived shortly after, and barely looks a day older. I just saw him. Again, just pure, great good luck. Nothing planned, just talent falling out of the sky. Jeff Anderson wandered back from the RAND Corporation, another MD, PhD. Nothing planned. Ben Chan turned up unannounced on our doorstep. We didn't know who he was. We looked at his CV, it sort of came in unannounced. bunch of us were agog, masters from Harvard, masters from Princeton. Where'd this guy come from? We snapped him up too. I mean, it was an endless amount of good fortune. And I could go on about the fabulous research coordinators, the analysts, the programmers. Even mentioning any names of the faculty gives me pause, because there's so many fantastic people here and not here who simply turned up. And as I said, in all these things, getting them going is about good fortune. What you and others have done is to sustain that vision, to capitalize on all those serendipitous circumstances, and to turn this into a going concern. And for that, as I said, not only do I want to express my own personal gratitude, but on behalf of so many others in this province, across the country, and I think arguably around the world, I want to express my appreciation. There is, however, an individual to whom I owe a particular debt, and he is here, and I have to twist his tail a bit because so many know and love him, and that is Jack Williams. Now, I want you to imagine Jack Williams, who was then perhaps 52, and some 35-year-old is appointed as his boss, the director of clinical epidemiology, where he is deputy director, and turns up in his realm. And worse yet, on what I think was my first visit to A4 with my then 2.5-year-old daughter in tow, standing outside of Jack's office, the first thing Carlene did was to urinate on the floor. Jack Williams, without batting an eyelash, said, "I guess she's marking your new territory for you." You know, that was a wonderful signpost to what Jack is about. Patience, forbearance, wisdom, humor, extraordinary insight. We owe so much to what Jack has done for so many in this room. And I have to say, how he tolerated me for 9 years of work at close range is still a mystery, but I do want to ask you to join me in thanking and acknowledging a great Canadian, Jack Williams. Now, you know, it's just terrible having the chance to reminisce, because I've got a whole list of people that I want to talk about: David Alter, Jack Tu, Trez Stuckel, Teresa To. So many of them, again, just fell from the sky. I'm going to try to contain this, lest it become too self-indulgent. But I want to focus on another theme, and that is the development of talent. We had, I think, a very lucky relationship with the University of Toronto. And here again, I do want to tell tales out of school. When the funding for ICES landed, it dawned on me that this might be relevant to the university's interest, since we, of course, had a very strong focus on attracting terrific young people, and through graduate and postdoctoral education, moving them forward. I picked up the phone to the then acting Dean of Medicine, Harvey Anderson, and said, well, we've been given $20 million, which was quite a lot in those times, to develop a new institute. Harvey, who is a wonderful individual and former chair of nutritional science, a giant, in fact, of nutritional science, was silent on the other end of the phone. And then he said, well, I'm not sure you should be talking to me. And being young and less respectful, I said, well, who would you like me to talk to? And he said, well, don't you have a department chair? It was at that moment, blindingly, I realized the Byzantine bureaucracy of the University of Toronto, and I should have run the other way instead of taking on my current role. But the hard reality was the university wasn't very interested. And it certainly had no idea what to do with us. Nonetheless, because we had so many wonderful people who were interested in mentorship and education, we were able to attract remarkable trainees. We also attracted individuals who had not followed the traditional academic path, but who founded ICES with its applied mandate, its mixture of investigator-driven and stakeholder-responsive activity, a way to flourish in an environment that had a mandate that allowed different modes of research to be pursued. And here I just want to acknowledge as a classic example, Peter Austin. Peter pitched up as more or less a research associate, relatively freshly minted PhD. I saw Peter outside and he still looks about 18 years old. I also looked at Peter's bio and his PubMed record last night out of sheer vulgar curiosity. 261 publications, many in outstanding journals, a dazzling array of collaborators, and full professor. And there are so many individuals who have found a home at ICES, whether it's Teresa Toe from the early days or Therese Stuckel, who came to us in part by accident and is still a wonderful bridge to Dartmouth and the Wenberg legacy there. So many of these individuals found a home at ICES, and in turn, they helped us to develop ensuing generations of health service researchers and clinical evaluative scientists, and we again were fortunate. I want to take a minute just to reflect a bit on two themes that I think were critical to what we tried to do and what I believe is still at the heart of the Institute. One of them is multidisciplinarity. The early team had people who were psychologists, statisticians, nurse decision scientists like Hilary Llewellyn-Thomas, sociologists with a demographic and quantitative lens like Jack Williams. It was a very diverse group. And I continue to believe that that diversity of disciplines and ideas was central to the success of the faculty. And from the standpoint of the research coordinators and the staff, diversity of disciplines has again been a cornerstone. A second element that was very important to our success was finding the right blend, point I already hinted at, between academic culture and a responsive or more applied research culture. And it's not as though there weren't tensions. There were individuals who wanted to sit and apply for research grants and be subsidized by the Institute, not unreasonably. And there were individuals who wanted to be out in the field making a difference, working primarily with the ministry or stakeholders. We had to find a way to bounce that off, and it was not easy in the early going. Indeed, as Maddie Reel will recall, in those early days, there were more than a few tensions between the clinical epidemiology unit and the new corporatized entity called ICES. And somehow that all got resolved. But finding those balances between the two poles of research activity has been one of the things that ICES has done absolutely brilliantly, maintaining its independence, valuing academic freedom, integrity of inquiry, but at the same time being responsive. This is no mean feat. And again, it's a credit to all of you and certainly to my successors that it has gone so well. I also have to say that with the clinical epidemiology unit, again, sheer good fortune arose when Don Redelmeyer returned from Stanford, and we were eventually able to persuade Don to take on the role of Director of Clinical Epidemiology, and he has made such creative use of that wonderful data source, what he calls the Hubble telescope of the ICES databases. Now, this, of course, is getting to be far too long a series of reminiscences and commentaries about the past, so let me spend a few moments trying to look forward. When I look at the healthcare system, ladies and gentlemen, I feel like Rip Van Winkle. I am struck by how little has really changed. We still don't have integrated care delivery systems that align incentives and enable the best use of all the wonderful information that you gather and the syntheses of evidence that others put together. We still don't have intelligent alignment of incentives in the system that enables quality and efficiency to come together to create value. We have yet again fiscal pressure. We have in healthcare, as in higher education, that most terrifying of concepts, government-led system transformation. Beam me up. A terrifying idea. And it is yesterday all over again. It will be so important for the Institute to keep doing what it is doing, but also important for the Institute's leadership and its various faculty and staff to opine on how this system needs to evolve for it to make better use of the good work you do. Because frankly, the receptor capacity is still underdeveloped, in my considered opinion. Indeed, while the system is much more quality focused than it was, while the leadership on the ground is far more progressive and so impressive in so many ways, the basic tools and incentives still have not aligned as one might like. So I certainly not only feel that there is an urgent need for the work of ICES, but there is also, I think, a need to consider, as we did 20 years ago, the importance of speaking to the receptor capacity and the policy sphere in hopes that a better set of arrangements may be achieved to make better use of the great work that you are all doing. What does the future hold longer term? That's all relatively medium term. The short answer is I have no idea. There are many familiar faces. There are a lot of new faces. There are individuals in the room who will have their own ideas about how to shape this remarkable entity. And it would be, I think, more than a little unseemly for someone who is here more by happenstance and serendipity than anything else to opine on where this accidental success should go. I could say, and I will say, that staying the course is actually an entirely defensible option, because what we have seen is steady innovation in the work of ICES, steady change and evolution in its structures to leverage more talent more widely. We've seen greater interdigitation with the clinical sphere in terms of data being enriched. We've seen more effective and efficient use of population health data to begin to bring together the epidemiology of populations with the epidemiology of healthcare. Over time, I'm sure we'll see more use of biomarkers, enrichment again of the data to make more sense of them in the era of personalized medicine. And there, of course, there's an obvious tension between the view of ICES at the aggregate and the shift in the biomolecular basis of the services that will be delivered. But all that, I'm confident, will be reconciled. So I do not stand up here with any great prognostications. Were I to try to do so, I think you might have to replicate the circumstances of 1991, which led to the drafting of what became the blueprint for ICES, and that might be difficult. Let me tell you what they were. Negotiations proceeding at an intensive pace with the OMA and the government. The idea of a resource for the system to improve the dialogue between physicians and government on the table. Urgent calls that I should prepare a proposal for an entity to respond to that. No time to respond to them. And then disastrously, a recognition that my mother-in-law was arriving. And more disastrously, that my wonderful spouse would be departing for Banff with my mother-in-law, and that I would be home with the nanny and 2 small children. Added to which, there was a little wrinkle. The day of the call, the nanny needed an emergency appendectomy. And there I was in the basement with that K-Pro trying to write a document and ask for $20 million. So, speaking of accidents, you will understand that there is very little prospect on behalf of this old guy to replicate those circumstances, nor much understanding of how we are where we are today. There is, however, only an enduring sense of gratitude to all of you for what you have done to move this wonderful institute forward, and a great sense of appreciation that I know I express for so many, as I have done already in these remarks, for the wonderful impact that you have had. That impact redounds not only in terms of the evidence and information you've marshaled for better decision-making and better health care, but it has been so important in terms of the education and training provided and the support of the next generations of health service researchers. For all that and so much more, I thank you, and I stand before you not only with less hair and more pounds, but duly humbled and grateful. Thank you so much, and congratulations.